Hey there, this screencast is about monetary policy in action. You'll get a chance to work 2 different problems on your own, and then I'll show you some solutions.
Here are the learning goals. We want to make sense of all the graphs we've done. We want to put together the real economy aggregate supply and demand model with the monetary economy, our money supply and demand model with liquidity preference specifically. We also want to understand the link between interest rates and aggregate demand, and finally use monetary policy to solve real-world policy problems like recessions. So without further ado, here's the question. Try it on your own and then I'll show you some solutions. I recommend pausing the video and actually doing it on a piece of paper. And when you're ready, unpause and I'll show you the solutions.
Alright, so let's start with the first part. Number 1, we need the aggregate supply and demand graph showing a recessionary gap. Make sure you've got everything labeled. And short run aggregate supply, upward sloping. Aggregate demand, downward sloping. How do we know it's a recession? When the equilibrium GDP is less than the potential GDP. The potential GDP is always placed at the long run aggregate supply curve. So this amount of GDP gap right here is a recession. So what needs to happen? Clearly, the GDP needs to increase, and we need to stimulate borrowing and spending. There's a couple of ways to do this. Fiscal policy has its own tools. Monetary policy uses the money supply to manipulate the interest rate. So which direction does interest rate go to stimulate spending? We want cheaper interest rates so that loans are less expensive for businesses and consumers. Car loans, new construction loans, etc.
How do we actually get interest rate down? Well, the Federal Reserve, which controls the money supply, is able to do some manipulation of the money supply, right? So if the liquidity preference model, which you can look into more detail in your textbook, looks like this. We have a downward sloping demand for money as people prefer to hold cash because of its liquidity, except when interest rates are very high. They prefer to hold other interest-bearing assets. Money does not earn them interest. And so demand for money is downward sloping. The supply of money is fixed by the Fed. And the intersection of the supply and demand for money gives us the equilibrium interest rate. Right? You can think of the interest rate as the price of using money, the cost of using money. So the price of money, it can be manipulated by the Fed. So the Fed controls the supply of money. All they need to do is to basically increase the supply of money, and voila, you get a lower interest rate. So how do they do that? Well, the 3 tools of monetary policy are to change the required reserve ratio, to change the discount rate, and you can read about those in your text, but those are not very useful on a day-to-day basis. Open market operations is the daily, most powerful, most often used tool of monetary policy. That's how the Fed actually gets money into the economy and out of the economy when it needs to. In this case, we want to increase the money supply, and so we need to get money into the economy. Increased money supply happens because remember, we want interest rates to fall. So how do we get those in there? Open market operations basically is the buying and selling of government bonds. Doesn't really matter what the good is. The Fed, just needs to get some money into the economy, and it goes to do that through the operation of buying something in the economy so that money goes from the Fed into the economy. So open market operations are the tool is the tool that it would use, and they would want to buy government bonds, right? Because we want money to come from the Fed into the economy. So they go to a bank, let's say, and they say, give us $10,000 worth of bonds and we'll give you a check in return. So these government bonds, these pieces of paper, these investments come to the Fed, and in return, money enters the banking system, and through the money multiplier, etc., money supply is increased. And then finally, what that looks like back over here, we've got a lower interest rate. And remember that fiscal and monetary policy primarily affects people's spending, right? It's a lot harder to control aggregate supply. So with a cheaper interest rate, people are stimulated to borrow and spend more. So aggregate demand increases, or should increase, if people respond to that cheaper interest rate. And the economy is pushed back to a higher GDP, right? And a higher price level. And here's the second problem. This one requires a little bit more detective work. So as you read it, notice that you're looking at actual data, and this gray vertical stripe denotes a recession. So again, we're graphing the aggregate supply and demand curves, and then we're showing what happened to either aggregate supply or demand to make this recession happen. And my hint would be, notice that unemployment is rising, which happens during recession. At the same time, GDP, which always falls during a recession, is accompanied by a drop in the consumer price index. So prices are dropping. So that between the two types of recessions that you can have, a supply side and a demand side recession, you need to decide which one is more likely to give you a falling GDP at the same time as a falling price. Again, pause it and work it out on your own, and then I'll share a solution. So, solving that first part of the problem, we have our aggregate supply and demand graphs up here, and we're starting from a position of long-run equilibrium. So our GDP is at potential. The only way that we can get a recession that has a falling price level is if aggregate demand drops. There's two ways you could answer this. You could sort of play with the graphs and shift your aggregate supply to the left, which gives you a recession, right? GDP is falling. But when aggregate supply shifts to the left, it gives you a higher new price level. We need a lower new price level to match the data, right? So an aggregate demand shock, a negative aggregate demand shock, is the only way you get this recession. The other way to think about it is to understand what was going on in 2008, and we have the housing bubble bursting, right? So real estate crisis, people's wealth drops, that's going to diminish their spending ability, and definitely aggregate demand. We would expect that to drop when wealth is demolished like it was in 2008. All right, now you put on your policy hats and you solve it. So consider what you want to have happen if you're a policymaker. Describe all the policy options, monetary and fiscal policy, that would get you back to your pre-recession equilibrium. Pause it, then I'll show you the solutions. So I've recreated the graph looking at our 2008 situation with a diminished aggregate demand. You can see we're below potential. Policy options. We've got fiscal policy. The tools are to change government spending or change taxes. Remember, we want to stimulate aggregate spending. We want to increase the aggregate demand. So what do we need to do? We need to pump money and spending into the economy. So that means either increase government spending or decrease taxes, or some combination of both.
Then, as we already discussed with monetary policy, we've got money supply needs to change interest rates. Right, we need to increase money supply to decrease interest rates, and we can do that with a reserve ratio, with a discount rate, or we can do open market operations, and the direction that would be to buy bonds to get money from the Fed into banks circulating through the economy. And a combination of those, or one or the other, you're going to get an increase in aggregate demand and get yourself out of that recession. Price goes up, and GDP also goes up. That is your post-policy equilibrium. Here's another part of the question. Exactly how big, using the multipliers, would the changes have to be? Pause the video, work it out on your own, and I'll give you some solutions. So the first question is about the spending multiplier. The spending multiplier is calculated as the inverse of the marginal propensity to save. We are given that the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, since they add up together to be 1. You either save or spend each dollar. We know that if MPC is 0.8, then your MPS has to be 0.2, right? Subtracting 0.8 from both sides gives us 0.2. So 20% is saved out of every extra dollar. And the generalized multiplier equation goes like this. The end change in spending is always equal to the initial change times the multiplier in question. So we have 2 of the 3. We need to solve for the third. What pieces of information do we have? We have that we know the end change needs to be 100 billion. How large would the change in government spending need to be? So they're asking us for this piece of information. They're saying we know we need to increase by 100 billion, and we don't know what that initial change is, but we know that the multiplier is 1 over 0.2, right? So we basically have this algebra problem. We've got 100 billion equals x times 1 over 0.2. So 100 billion equals x times 5. Divide both sides by 5, and you get x equals 20. We need to increase government spending by 20 billion. Let the multiplier, which is about size 5, work through, and we'll get 100 billion at the end of the day. And in the second part of the question, we need the tax multiplier, which is MPC over MPS, or this term, 1 over MPC, the spending multiplier, multiplied by the MPC, to note that people save. If you give them a tax cut, they're going to save, in this case, 20%. So only 80%, or the MPC, times the spending change is actually going to see the economy. It's going to actually get into the economy. The rest is going to be saved. So it's a little bit smaller. Tax multiplier is always smaller than the spending multiplier to allow for the savings that people do at the very beginning when they receive that check in the mail. And so we have, again, 2 pieces of the 3 pieces of this equation. So we have the end change in spending, which is still 100 billion, equal to the initial change, which we don't know, times the tax multiplier, MPC over MPS. So that's 0.8 divided by 0.2. So tax multiplier is 4 instead of 5. So we've got 100 billion equals x times 4. And divide both sides by 4, and you get 25 billion is the size of this tax change. And remember to go in the right direction. If we want to increase spending, we need to cut taxes. So we need to cut taxes by 25 billion, and it is a decrease. And finally, we're asked about the money multiplier. So the other piece of information we have in this question is that the required reserve ratio is 10%, which we need for the money multiplier, which is the inverse of the required reserve ratio. Almost exactly the same equation for the money multiplier as for the other multipliers. The end change in money supply equals the initial change times the money multiplier. So let's see what we have in this piece of the question. 100 billion is how much we need to change the money supply, and there's no way you could, by the way, that is just given. There's no way you could figure that out, how big that is. You'd have to be given that. So that was just pulled out of thin air by me. So 100 billion is equal to the initial change, which we don't know, times the money multiplier, which is 1 over the required reserve ratio, or 1 over 10%, or 0.1. So we've got, again, some algebra to do. We've got 100 billion equals x times 10. So divide both sides by 10, divide by 10, and we've got x is 10 billion. We need to inject money supply. We need to inject 10 billion into the money supply. So those are all the policy options the Fed has, the Fed and the federal government have. The federal government is in charge of fiscal policy, so the first two would be the federal government, the last would be the Fed. Any of these policies would get you to increase spending, right? So the first two increase spending by 100 billion. The last would increase money supply by 100 billion, remembering that that would lead to a reduction in interest rate, which would shift the aggregate demand rightward, eventually giving us an increase in spending as well.